The rain in Portland is never just rain. It is a persistent, grey shroud that clings to your skin, seeping through layers of wool and regret until it finds the marrow of your bones. I sat on a damp piece of cardboard that had once held a flat-screen television, a luxury for someone else, while the Willamette River churned a muddy brown just a few feet away. The underside of the Burnside Bridge is a cathedral of exhaust fumes and forgotten souls, where the roar of the city above sounds like the heartbeat of a beast that has already swallowed you whole. My feet, swollen and encased in shoes that had lost their tread 3 months ago, throbbed with a rhythm that matched the distant thud of tires on the expansion joints overhead. Every vibration felt like a hammer blow to my dignity. I closed my eyes, trying to summon the scent of cedar and old books from my house in West Hills, but all I could smell was the wet concrete and the sharp, metallic tang of poverty. It is a strange thing to be invisible in a city where you once taught 3 generations of children how to read. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, a spectre of the woman who used to grade papers by a fireplace with a cup of Earl Grey tea. "Evelyn, is that really you?" The voice cracked the silence of my internal misery like a stone hitting glass. I didn't want to look up. To look up was to acknowledge the reflection in the eyes of the world, and I knew what I looked like now. I was a collection of greying hair, tattered coats, and the hollowed-out stare of a person who had seen the bottom of the abyss. But the voice was familiar, a ghost from a time when the world was warm and predictable. It was Clara. Clara, who used to bring me lemon bars every Tuesday when our husbands were still alive, and the only tragedy we knew was a late frost in the garden. I felt a surge of shame so violent it made my stomach churn. I wanted to disappear into the cracks of the bridge, to melt into the river and be carried out to the Pacific, where the salt could wash away the stain of my failure. I looked up slowly. Clara stood there, her umbrella a bright, mocking yellow against the gloom. She looked horrified. Her hand was pressed against her mouth, and I could see the way her eyes travelled over my stained collar, the dirt beneath my fingernails, and the pathetic pile of my remaining life stuffed into 2 plastic grocery bags. She looked at me as if I were a tragedy she had read about in the newspaper but never expected to touch. "Evelyn, my God, what happened? Why are you sitting here? Where is your house? Where is Julian?" Her questions were like arrows, each one finding a soft spot in my heart that I thought had already turned to stone. Julian. My son. The boy I had carried for 9 months and loved for 38 years. The man who had held my hand at his father's funeral and promised me that I would never have to worry about a thing. I tried to speak, but my throat was a desert of dust and unspoken truths. I cleared it, the sound harsh and ugly in the damp air. "He took it, Clara," I whispered, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "Julian took the house to take care of me. That is what he said. He said it was for my own good." The words felt like poison leaving my system, yet they left me feeling emptier than before. Clara stepped closer, oblivious to the mud splashing against her expensive leather boots. She reached out to touch my shoulder, but I flinched. I didn't want her pity. Pity is just a way for the comfortable to feel better about their own safety. I wanted my life back. I wanted the smell of the roses in my garden and the sound of my own key turning in the lock. I wanted to wake up in a bed that didn't smell like other people's desperation. "He took it." "What do you mean he took it?" "That house was yours, Evelyn. It was paid for. Robert worked 40 years to make sure you were set." "He had papers, Clara. So many papers. And Ava. Ava was there with her cold, perfect smile, telling me that the taxes were too high, that the roof was failing, that I was becoming forgetful. They told me I didn't have to handle the burden anymore. They said they would move me into the guest suite, the one with the big window overlooking the valley. They said I would have the best doctors and someone to cook my meals. Julian knelt by my chair and took my hands, and I saw the little boy he used to be. I saw the child who cried when he scraped his knee, and I believed him. I believed him because a mother is programmed to believe that the heart she grew inside her own body cannot be hollow. I stopped, the memory of that evening rising up like a nauseating wave. The dining room table had been cleared, and the light from the chandelier had glinted off Julian's gold watch, a gift from me for his promotion. He had looked so successful, so capable. He had laid out the documents with the precision of a surgeon, his voice a soothing melody of concern and filial duty. "It's just a transfer for estate planning, Mom," he had told me. "To protect your assets from the state if you ever need long-term care. You'll stay right here, but on paper, I'll be the one responsible. It's the smart move. Don't you trust me?" Trust. It is a word that should be sacred between a mother and her child. But for Julian, it was a weapon. I had picked up the pen, my fingers trembling slightly. I remember the weight of the ink on the paper, the way the letters of my name looked so small and insignificant as I signed away 30 years of memories and the only security I had left. I had looked at Ava, and for a split second, the mask of the doting daughter-in-law had slipped. I saw the hunger in her eyes, a sharp, predatory glint that I had mistaken for excitement for our new living arrangement. "But you're here, Evelyn. You're under a bridge. How can you be here if they were taking care of you?" Clara's voice was rising now, attracting the attention of a few other men huddled under the concrete arches. I lowered my head, the humiliation of physical weight on my neck. "It started with the basement," I said, my words coming faster now, a floodgate breaking. "A few weeks after the papers were filed, Julian told me that they needed the guest suite for an office. Ava's career was taking off, he said. She needed a professional space. He told me the basement was cooler, better for my joints. He moved my bed down there, among the Christmas decorations and the cobwebs. He told me it was temporary. But then the locks changed, not all of them at first, just the front door. I would go out for a walk to the park, and I would come back to find the door bolted. I would have to wait for hours on the porch until they decided to let me in. They stopped inviting me to the table. Ava said my coughing annoyed her. She said I smelled like old age. Julian, he wouldn't even look at me. He would stare at his phone while his wife told me I was a guest in their home, and that guests should be seen and not heard. I could see the fury radiating off Clara. It was a clean, sharp anger that I was too exhausted to feel myself. I was just tired. I was tired of the cold, tired of the rain, and tired of the silence that had become my only companion. The night they threw me out, it was raining just like this, I continued, the memory fractured and sharp. Julian came down to the basement. He didn't look at me. He just held a trash bag. He said they were selling the house. He said they had found a buyer who offered $2 million, cash. I asked him where I was supposed to go, and he told me that he had looked into some places, but they were all too expensive. He told me that I had been a drain on their finances for long enough. He said, "Mom, you always told me to be a man of action. I'm doing what's best for my family now." And then he led me to the door. He gave me my coat and those 2 bags, and he closed the door. I heard the deadbolt click. It was the loudest sound I have ever heard. I walked until my feet bled, Clara. I walked until I couldn't remember the way home because the home I knew didn't exist anymore. Clara was crying now, the tears mingling with the dampness of the air. She dropped her umbrella and reached down, pulling me up from the cardboard. My joints screamed in protest, a cacophony of pain that nearly made me lose consciousness. I felt her strength, her solid, living warmth against my tattered sleeves. "You are coming with me, Evelyn. Right now. We are getting you out of this cold. We are getting you food and a hot bath, and then we are going to call someone. This is not the end. I don't care what Julian thinks he did. You are not a ghost, and you are not going to die under a bridge." I let her lead me away from the concrete arches, away from the smell of the river and the roar of the beast. I looked back once at the piece of cardboard where I had spent the last 3 nights. It looked so small, a tiny island of brown in a sea of grey. I thought about Julian, probably sitting in a warm restaurant right now, ordering a steak and a bottle of wine with the money he had stolen from my life. I thought about the way he used to call me Mummy when he had a nightmare, and I wondered when the boy I loved had been replaced by the man who could leave his mother to freeze in the dark. As we walked toward Clara's car, the rain intensified, turning the world into a blur of light and water. I felt a flicker of something in my chest, a tiny spark that wasn't just the cold. It was the beginning of a realization. Julian thought he had erased me. He thought that by taking my house, he had taken my existence. But as I felt the warmth of the car's heater hit my face, I knew he was wrong. He had taken the bricks and the mortar, the cedar and the books. But he hadn't taken the truth. And the truth, I realized, was the only thing Julian couldn't sell for $2 million. "I have the audio, Clara," I whispered, as she pulled away from the curb, my hand clutched around the old smartphone I had hidden in the lining of my coat, the one Julian didn't know I still had. "I recorded the night he told me he was selling the house. I recorded it all." Clara looked at me, her eyes widening in the rearview mirror. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like a woman who was about to haunt the people who thought they had buried her alive. The road ahead was long and dark, much like the Portland winter, but as the bridge disappeared into the mist behind us, I knew I was no longer sitting in the cold. I was moving toward a reckoning that Julian Miller could never have imagined when he closed that door on his mother. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, watching the city lights smear into long golden streaks. My mind was a whirlpool of images: Julian's first steps on the lawn of the West Hills house, the way Robert used to laugh when the sprinkler hit him, and then the image of that deadbolt sliding into place. The betrayal was a physical weight, a stone in my stomach that refused to be digested. Julian had gambled everything on the idea that I was too weak, too old, and too ashamed to fight back. He had counted on the stigma of homelessness to keep me quiet, believing that his mother would rather rot in obscurity than let the world know her son was a monster. He had underestimated the one thing he had never been able to control: my capacity for endurance. I had survived the loss of my husband, the loss of my career, and the slow, agonizing erosion of my family. Being under that bridge hadn't broken me. It had merely stripped away everything that wasn't essential. "We'll get a lawyer, Evelyn," Clara said, her voice firm as she navigated the slick streets. "The best one in the city. I have some money put aside, and Robert's brother still has connections at the firm on Fifth Avenue. They won't know what hit them." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was busy cataloguing the items Julian had thrown away: the quilt my mother had made, the silver spoons from my grandmother, the photo albums that held the only evidence that we were ever a happy family. Those things were gone, likely sold at some estate auction or tossed into a dumpster to make room for Ava's minimalist decor. The thought of a stranger sleeping in my bed, looking out my window, made me feel a fresh surge of nausea. But as Clara turned the car onto her quiet, tree-lined street, I felt a different sensation. It was the return of my name. I wasn't the guest anymore. I wasn't the cough or the smell. I was Evelyn Miller. And I was coming home, even if home was a place I had to rebuild from the ashes of my son's greed. We pulled into Clara's driveway, and she helped me out of the car. The house was a small bungalow, the porch light casting a warm, inviting glow on the wet pavement. It was a humble place compared to the mansion Julian had stolen, but to me, it looked like a palace. I stood there for a moment, letting the rain wash over me one last time before stepping inside. I looked up at the grey Portland sky and thought of the thousands of people still under those bridges, people who didn't have a Clara, people whose sons had also decided they were no longer worth the cost of a room. My heart went out to them, but my mind was focused on the battle ahead. I had spent my life teaching children that every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Julian had written my beginning and my middle, but I was the one who was going to write the final chapter. And it wasn't going to be a tragedy, it was going to be a lesson. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lavender and cinnamon. Clara led me to the bathroom, her hands gentle as she helped me peel off my wet, grimy layers. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror and didn't look away this time. I looked at the wrinkles, the grey hair, the hollow cheeks. I looked at the woman Julian had tried to destroy. I saw the pain, yes, but I also saw something else. I saw the eyes of a teacher who had seen it all and wasn't afraid of a bully, even if that bully was her own son. "Go on," Clara whispered, handing me a plush, white towel. "Take as long as you need. I'm going to make us some soup." I stepped into the shower, and as the hot water hit my skin, I let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. The dirt of the bridge washed down the drain, a dark swirl of failure and filth. I scrubbed my skin until it was red, wanting to be clean, needing to be whole. I thought of the audio recording on my phone, the digital ghost of Julian's cruelty. It was my only weapon, a tiny piece of light in a very dark world. Julian thought he was a master of real estate, but he had forgotten the most important rule of any transaction. Never underestimate the person who has nothing left to lose. I closed my eyes and let the steam fill my lungs, preparing myself for the war that was coming. I was Evelyn Miller, and I was no longer invisible. The steam from the hot shower had filled the small bathroom, but it couldn't touch the deep, ancient chill that had settled into my bones under the Burnside Bridge. I wrapped myself in the plush white towel Clara had given me, but my skin felt like it didn't belong to me anymore. It felt like a rented garment, worn out and stained by the world's indifference. I stared at the fogged-up mirror, and for a moment I saw the ghost of the West Hills house in the swirling white vapour. I could almost smell the mahogany polish and the faint scent of rain-dampened earth from the garden. That house wasn't just a structure of wood and stone, it was the physical manifestation of Robert's love, of 40 years of shared breakfasts, and of the quiet, steady rhythm of a life well lived. Now it was a crime scene, though no yellow tape marked its boundaries. The crime hadn't been committed with a knife or a gun, but with a fountain pen and a smile that I had once believed was my greatest achievement as a mother. I closed my eyes, and the memory of that evening rushed back with the force of a tidal wave. It was a Tuesday in September, the air crisp with the first hints of autumn. Julian had come over with Ava, carrying a bottle of expensive Chardonnay and a leather portfolio that looked too heavy for a casual visit. I had spent the afternoon baking a pot roast, the kitchen filled with the warm, savoury aroma of home. I remember the way the light caught the dust motes dancing in the air of the dining room, a room that had seen Julian's first birthday, his high school graduation party, and the sombre wake we held for Robert. I had polished the silver, wanting everything to be perfect for my son. I didn't know then that I was preparing a feast for my own executioners. "Mum, you look tired," Julian had said, his voice dripping with a concern that I now recognize as a carefully rehearsed script. He had stood behind my chair, his hands resting on my shoulders. I had leaned back into his touch, feeling a surge of pride. My son, the successful realtor, the man who knew the value of every square inch of this city. I thought he was protecting me. I thought he was the fortress Robert had promised he would be. "The house is a lot, Evelyn," Ava had added, her voice smooth and cool, like silk over a blade. She sat across from me, her perfect manicure clicking against the stem of her wineglass. "Julian was looking at the tax assessments today. They've tripled in 5 years. And that leak in the roof? The estimate was $10,000 just to patch it. We hate seeing you stressed like this. You should be enjoying your retirement, traveling, visiting museums, not worrying about plumbing and property taxes." I had looked around the room, at the crown moulding Robert had installed himself, at the height marks on the doorframe where Julian had grown from a toddler into a man. "I like taking care of it," I had whispered, but my voice sounded small even to me. "It keeps me busy. It keeps me close to your father." Julian had sat down then, leaning in close, his eyes wide and earnest. This was the Julian I knew, or thought I knew. The boy who used to bring me dandelions and promised to build me a castle. "We want to make sure you're protected, Mum. If anything happens to you, the state could take this house to pay for medical bills. But if we transfer it into a trust now, if you put it in my name, it's safe. It stays in the family. You stay here, exactly as you are. But I handle the headaches. I'll pay the taxes. I'll hire the contractors. You'll just be the queen of the manor, without the crown of thorns." He had opened the portfolio then. The pages were crisp, the legalese dense and intimidating. I am a teacher, a woman of letters, but those documents were written in a language designed to obscure the truth. I looked for the word eviction, but it wasn't there. I looked for the word betrayal, but it was hidden behind terms like quitclaim deed and irrevocable trust. "Are you sure, Julian?" I had asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Your father wanted me to have this house until the end." "Dad would want you to be safe, Mum," Julian had said, his voice dropping an octave, a note of gentle reproach creeping in. "Don't you trust me? I'm your son. I'm the only one you have left." That was the hook, the guilt, the silent accusation that my hesitation was a failure of motherly love. I felt a flush of shame. How could I doubt my own boy? How could I believe that the child I had nursed and nurtured would ever want me to suffer? I picked up the pen. I remember the weight of it, the cold gold of the barrel against my skin. I signed my name over and over. Every stroke of the pen felt like a thread being pulled from the tapestry of my life. I signed away the garden, I signed away the attic, I signed away the room where Robert had died. When I was finished, the ink looked black and final, like a line of ants marching away with my future. Ava had smiled then. It wasn't the smile of a doting daughter-in-law, it was the smile of a shark that had finally tasted blood. She had snapped the portfolio shut with a sound like a gunshot. "Well," she had said, her voice suddenly crisp and businesslike. "That's settled. Now, about that guest suite downstairs. We were thinking it would be much more efficient for your joints if we moved your primary living space to the garden level." The garden level. That was their name for the basement. The transition was a slow-motion car crash. It didn't happen overnight, but the erosion of my life was relentless. Within a month, my bedroom furniture had been moved into the basement, a cold, damp space that smelled of laundry detergent and old newspapers. Julian told me it was because they needed the upstairs room for an innovation lab for Ava's consulting business. I had stood in the doorway of my old room, watching men I didn't know carry out the vanity Robert had bought me for our 20th anniversary. They handled it like junk, scratching the wood against the doorframe. I wanted to scream, but the words died in my throat. I was a guest now, a guest in the house Robert had built for me. The meals were the next to go. At first, I was invited up for dinner, but the atmosphere was thick with a tension that made the food taste like ash. Ava would spend the entire hour talking about market trends and portfolio optimization, while Julian stared at his steak, refusing to catch my eye. Then came the evening Ava suggested that it might be easier if I had my meals in the basement. She said my presence made it difficult for them to discuss sensitive business matters. I remember sitting at the small card table Julian had set up for me next to the water heater. I had a bowl of canned soup and a piece of dry toast. Upstairs, I could hear the muffled sounds of laughter and the clinking of wine glasses. I could hear the life I had built continuing without me, as if I were already dead and buried beneath their feet. I felt like a ghost haunting my own kitchen. I would go up for a glass of water in the middle of the night, moving like a thief in the dark, terrified of waking the people who had stolen my world. Then the locks changed. I had gone for a walk to the rose garden, needing to touch something that still recognized me. When I returned, the key that had been in my pocket for 30 years wouldn't turn. I had stood on the porch for 3 hours, a light drizzle, my knuckles raw from knocking. When Julian finally opened the door, he didn't apologize. He looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and pity. "We had to upgrade the security, Mum," he said, his voice flat. "Ava's firm handles high-level data. We can't have the house open to just anyone. I forgot to get you a new key. Just stay in the garden level for now. I'll leave the side door unlocked." The side door was the door to the garage. It was the door they used for the trash. The humiliation was a poison that seeped into my soul. I stopped calling my friends. I stopped going to church. I couldn't bear the questions, the looks of sympathy, the inevitable, "How is Julian?" I was too ashamed to admit that my son had turned me into a prisoner in my own basement. I began to doubt my own mind. Ava would tell me I had left the stove on when I hadn't used it in days. She would claim I had lost my hearing, screaming at me until my ears rang, only to whisper to Julian that I was slipping. They were gaslighting me, dimming the lights of my reality, until I felt like I was disappearing into the shadows of the water heater. I remember one night, huddled under 3 blankets in the damp basement air, hearing Julian and Ava arguing upstairs. Their voices drifted through the floorboards, sharp and ugly. "We could get 2.5 if we sell now," Ava was saying. "The market is peaking. We could move to that condo in Pearl District. Think of the commute, Julian. Think of the lifestyle." "What about Mum?" Julian's voice was a low murmur, lacking the strength I had once admired. "There are facilities, Julian. Professional places. She needs more care than we can give her. Look at her. She's obsessed with that basement. It's not healthy. If we sell the house, we can pay for a decent place. Somewhere she'll be among people her own age." Facilities. A decent place. They were talking about me as if I were a piece of furniture they were planning to trade in for a newer model. I felt a cold, sharp clarity in that moment. Julian wasn't protecting my assets. He was liquidating my life. He had never intended for me to stay in the house. The trust, the guest suite, the care. It was all an elaborate lie designed to get me to sign the deed without a fight. I had been a pawn in a real estate transaction, and the game was almost over. I had reached for my old smartphone then, the one Robert had insisted I learn to use. I had tapped the voice memo icon. I didn't know why I was doing it, only that I needed to capture the sound of my own destruction. I had held the phone toward the ceiling, capturing the muffled sounds of their greed. "I don't know, Ava," Julian had sighed. "She won't go quietly. She loves this place." "She doesn't have a choice, Julian," Ava had snapped. "The house is in your name. You can do whatever you want with it. Now sign the listing agreement. We have a viewing on Friday." I had sat there in the dark, the phone clutched in my hand, listening to the scratch of a pen on paper. I knew that sound. It was the sound of a heart breaking. It was the sound of a mother realizing that the person she had loved most in the world was a stranger. I didn't cry. I was beyond tears. I was in a place of cold, hard stone. I realized then that I wasn't just losing a house. I was losing the Julian I had raised. I was realizing that the boy who used to bring me dandelions was dead, and in his place was a man who could calculate the value of his mother's misery in dollars and cents. The shower water had turned cold long ago, but I stood there, the memories burning hot in my mind. I looked at the white towel, the borrowed clothes, the small, safe space of Clara's bathroom. I thought about the ink on those papers, the ink that had felt like blood. Julian thought he was a master of the deal, but he had forgotten one thing. He had forgotten that a teacher always knows when a student is lying. He had forgotten that a mother's love is a powerful thing, but a mother's rage is a force of nature. I stepped out of the shower, my skin tingling. Julian had taken the house. He had taken the silver and the mahogany, but he hadn't taken the recording. He hadn't taken the truth. And as I looked at my reflection in the cleared mirror, I knew that the ink of betrayal was about to be washed away by the tide of my reckoning. I dried myself slowly, my movements deliberate. Every ache in my joints felt like a call to arms. I thought about the way Julian had knelt by my chair, the way he had looked me in the eye, and lied with the ease of a man who had sold his soul long ago. I thought about Ava's perfect smile and her predatory eyes. They thought they had buried me in the basement, but they had only planted a seed. Julian Miller had no idea that the woman he had discarded like trash was about to become the storm that would tear his perfect life apart. I reached for the clothes Clara had left for me, a simple grey sweater and a pair of trousers. They were clean. They were mine. And as I pulled them on, I felt the first real stirrings of a power I hadn't felt in years. Julian had the house, but I had the story. And in this world, the story is the only thing that truly lasts. I walked out of the bathroom, the steam following me like a ghost. Clara was in the kitchen, the sound of a spoon clinking against a bowl, a comforting domestic rhythm. I sat at the table, and she pushed a bowl of thick, golden squash soup toward me. I took a spoonful, the warmth spreading through my chest. It was the first time in months I didn't feel like I was eating stolen bread. "I remember everything, Clara," I said, my voice steady. "Every word, every lie, every stroke of the pen. He didn't just take my house. He tried to take my dignity, but he failed." Clara sat across from me, her eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. "He failed the moment he left you under that bridge, Evelyn. He failed the moment he decided that money was more important than a mother's heart. Now tell me about the lawyer. Tell me what we need to do to take back what he stole." I looked at the window, at the Portland rain streaking the glass. Somewhere out there, Julian and Ava were celebrating their $2 million deal. They were probably looking at condos in the Pearl, drinking champagne, and laughing about the old woman they had finally outsmarted. They thought they had won. They thought the ink of betrayal was permanent. But as I took another sip of the warm soup, I knew they were wrong. The story was just beginning, and Julian Miller was about to find out that a mother's memory is the longest and most unforgiving thing in the world. The basement was not just a room, it was a grave for a living woman. In the West Hills house, the basement had once been a place of life, a workshop where Robert built birdhouses and I kept the fabric for my quilts. Now, it was a damp concrete box that smelled of mildew and the slow, agonizing death of my self-respect. I would sit for hours on the edge of the twin bed they had moved down there, listening to the life above me. The ceiling was thin, or perhaps my hearing had become hypersensitized by the silence of my own isolation. I could hear the sharp, rhythmic click of Ava's designer heels on the hardwood floors, a sound that felt like it was stepping directly onto my chest. I could hear the low, indistinguishable murmur of Julian's voice, a voice that had once asked me to read him bedtime stories and now wouldn't even say good morning. I had become a ghost in my own kitchen, a phantom that moved through the house only when the masters were away or asleep. I learned to recognize the sound of the garage door closing, a signal that I could safely ascend the stairs to find a glass of water or a piece of fruit without being told I was an eyesore. Why did I stay so long in that darkness? Why did I allow myself to be shunted aside like a broken chair? The answer is a mother's curse. I stayed because I was waiting for my son to come back. Not the man Julian had become, but the boy who used to hide his face in my skirt when he was afraid. I was waiting for a miracle that Julian's greed had already strangled in its sleep. The gaslighting was a slow poison. It didn't happen all at once. It was a comment here, a sigh there. Ava would leave a burner on the stove and then scream down the basement stairs. "Evelyn, you're going to burn us all down. You're losing it, you know that. You're a danger to this family." I would climb the stairs, my knees clicking, to find the stove glowing red and Ava standing there with her arms crossed, her eyes cold and triumphant. I knew I hadn't touched the stove. I hadn't been upstairs in 6 hours. But Julian would just look at me with a mixture of disgust and rehearsed pity, shaking his head as if I were a tragedy he was tired of watching. "Maybe Ava is right, Mum. Maybe we need to look into more restrictive options. You're becoming a liability." A liability. That was the word he used for the woman who had worked 2 jobs to pay for his college tuition. I wanted to scream, to throw the copper pots Robert had bought me across the room, to demand my name back. But the suppression was too great. I felt like I was underwater, my voice muffled by the weight of their combined contempt. I would just nod and retreat back to the basement, back to the shadows where ghosts belong. One evening I found a box of Robert's things in the hallway next to the trash. It was his old tackle box, the one he had used every summer at Crater Lake. I knelt on the floor, my fingers tracing the worn plastic, the memories of the smell of fish and pine needles washing over me like a phantom limb. I opened it and saw the lures he had hand-tied, the small, colourful feathers he had worked on with so much patience. I felt a sob catch in my throat, a raw, jagged thing. This was all I had left of the man who had loved me, and it was being discarded as refuse. Ava walked into the hallway then, her phone pressed to her ear. She didn't even stop. She just nudged the box with her toe, pushing it further toward the door. "Julian, the junk removal guys are coming at 8 tomorrow," she said into the phone, her voice as sharp as a razor. "Make sure the old lady doesn't dig anything back out. It's all clutter. Everything in this house is clutter now." Clutter. 40 years of marriage, 40 years of raising a child, 40 years of building a legacy, all reduced to a word that means something to be thrown away. I took one of the lures, a small blue one with silver tinsel, and hid it in the pocket of my cardigan. It was the only piece of Robert I saved that night. I sat in the basement and held that lure until the hooks bit into my palm, but I didn't feel the pain. I didn't feel anything. I was entering the stage of absolute coldness. I realized then that they weren't just taking the house. They were systematically erasing every trace that I had ever existed. They were clearing the stage for their new life, a life built on the bones of my sacrifice. I looked at the basement walls, the grey concrete that seemed to be closing in, and I felt a strange, terrifying calm. I was at the bottom of the U-curve, in the deepest part of the shadow. I was no longer a mother. I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed from the path of a $2 million real estate deal. The final night came without warning. It was a Monday, the rain hammering against the small, dirt-streaked basement window that looked out at the ankles of the world. I was heating a tin of tomato soup on a hot plate Julian had given me because Ava didn't want me contaminating her professional kitchen anymore. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and cheap soup. I heard the footsteps above, heavier than usual. Then, the basement door opened. Julian didn't come down the stairs. He stood at the top, silhouetted against the bright, warm light of the hallway I was no longer allowed to walk in. He was holding 2 black plastic trash bags. He looked like a man taking out the garbage, and in a way, that is exactly what he was doing. "Mom," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the melody he used when he was selling houses to strangers. "We've sold the place. The new owners want a quick close. They're moving in on Thursday." I stood up, the small plastic spoon in my hand, feeling like a toy. "Thursday? Julian, where am I supposed to go? You said this was my home. You said the trust was to protect me." "The trust has been liquidated, Mum. The house is sold. Ava and I are moving to the Pearl tomorrow. We found a nice place, but it's only 2 bedrooms. There just isn't room. We looked into some senior living communities, but your assets are tied up in the debt Julian had to pay off from the business. There isn't enough for a deposit." I felt the soup turn to lead in my stomach. The debt he was talking about was the gambling losses I had overheard them whispering about months ago. He hadn't just stolen my house. He had gambled away the money from the sale before the ink was even dry on the deed. He was a thief, and a reckless one at that. "So where am I supposed to go, Julian? Tell me. Look at me and tell me." He finally looked down the stairs. For a second, just a second, I saw a flicker of the boy who used to be afraid of the dark. But then his jaw tightened, the mask of the cold, successful professional sliding back into place. He threw the 2 trash bags down the stairs. They landed with a heavy thud on the concrete floor. "Your things are in there, Mum. Most of the other stuff. We had to clear it out for the staging. I'm sorry, but this is how it has to be. I've put a few $100s in an envelope in the side pocket of your coat. It'll get you through a few nights at a motel until you can figure things out. You were always so independent, right? You always told me that Millers don't ask for handouts." The cruelty of using my own words of encouragement against me was the final blow. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I stood there in the grey light of the basement and watched my son walk away. I heard the door close, and then the sound that will haunt me until the day I die, the click of the deadbolt. He hadn't just asked me to leave. He had locked me out of the past. He had locked me out of the only place I had ever felt safe. I picked up the bags. They were light. They contained a few changes of clothes, some old sweaters, and the photo album I had managed to hide under my mattress. Everything else, the silver, the quilts, the letters Robert had sent me from the naval base, was gone. I walked out through the garage door, the smell of exhaust fumes and rain greeting me like a cold slap. I didn't look back at the West Hills house. I couldn't. I knew that if I looked back, The memory of what it used to be would kill me before the rain did. I walked down the steep hills of Portland, the water soaking through my thin cardigan within minutes. My shoes, which Julian had once told me were perfectly fine for an old woman, were thin and offered no protection against the slick, cold pavement. I walked until the lights of the mansions faded and the grey, industrial sprawl of the city began. I walked until I reached the Burnside Bridge. I didn't know why I went there. Maybe it was because the bridge looked like the only thing in the city that was as broken and exposed as I was. I found a piece of cardboard and sat down. The concrete was freezing, a relentless, unyielding cold that seemed to suck the very life out of me. I sat there and watched the river, the dark water flowing toward an ocean I would never see. I thought about the night Julian was born. It had been a long labor, a night of fire and pain. When they finally put him in my arms, I had whispered to him that I would never let anything hurt him. I had promised him the world. I had spent 38 years keeping that promise, shielding him from the cold, feeding his dreams with the fuel of my own hard work. And this was the return. This was the interest on my investment. 2 plastic trash bags and a piece of cardboard under a bridge. The suppression I felt was absolute. I wasn't just hungry or cold. I was hollow. I felt like I had been hollowed out by a giant spoon, leaving only a thin shell of a woman behind. I sat in the silence of the city, a silence that was louder than the roar of the traffic above. I thought about the lure in my pocket, the tiny silver tinsel. It was the only thing I had that still had Robert's touch on it. I gripped it until the hook drew blood, and for the first time in hours, I felt a flicker of something. It wasn't pain. It was a cold, sharp realization. Julian hadn't just taken my house. He had murdered the woman I used to be. The Evelyn Miller who believed in the sanctity of family, the woman who thought a son's love was a permanent thing. She was dead. She had died the moment that deadbolt clicked. What was left sitting under the bridge was someone else. Someone colder. Someone who had seen the bottom of the abyss and realized that there was nothing left to fear. I looked up at the grey Portland sky, the rain stinging my eyes, and I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a witness. I was the witness to the ultimate betrayal. I was the ghost in the kitchen that had finally been cast out, but ghosts don't stay in the shadows forever. They come back to haunt the living. They come back to demand an accounting. The night deepened, the cold turning into a sharp, biting wind that whipped under the bridge. I huddled closer to the concrete pillar, the trash bags tucked around me like a pathetic shield. I thought about the envelope in my coat pocket. A few $100. Julian's mercy. It was the price of his conscience, a cheap payment to buy his own sleep. I reached into my pocket and touched the envelope, but I didn't open it. I didn't want his money. Every dollar in that envelope was a piece of my soul that he had sold. I sat there, the ghost of a woman, while the city of Portland moved around me, oblivious to the tragedy under its feet. I realized then that my son had made a mistake. He thought that by taking everything, he had left me with nothing. But he had forgotten that when you have nothing, you have the truth. And the truth is the most dangerous thing in the world for a man like Julian Miller. I looked at the dark water of the river and felt a strange, icy resolve. The U-curve had hit the bottom. There was nowhere left to go but up or out into the dark. And as the rain continued to fall, I knew I wasn't going out into the dark. I was going to find a way to make the light shine on the man who had locked his mother in the basement. I lay my head against the cold concrete, my eyes fixed on a single, distant street lamp. The silence was no longer heavy. It was expectant. I was waiting for the morning not because I thought it would be better, but because I knew it would be the first day of a new world, a world where I was no longer a mother, but a survivor. A world where Julian Miller would eventually have to look into the eyes of the ghost he had created and realize that he hadn't won a real estate deal. He had lost his soul. The wind howled through the bridge's structure, a mournful sound that echoed the scream I was keeping locked inside. I thought about the photo album in the bag, the pictures of Julian's first steps, his first tooth, his wedding day. I realized I would never look at them again. They were lies. They were pictures of a dream that had turned into a nightmare. I closed my eyes and let the cold take me, a deep, numbing sleep that was the only mercy the bridge had to offer. I was the ghost in the kitchen, and I was finally ready to stop haunting the past and start haunting the man who had sold it. Clara's house felt too quiet, the kind of silence that has a weight to it, like a blanket that is just a bit too heavy. I sat by the window in her guest room, watching the Portland rain smear the world into a grey, unrecognizable blur. For 3 days, I had done nothing but sleep and eat the small, careful meals she placed in front of me. Every time I woke up, my first instinct was to look for the concrete pillars of the Burnside Bridge, to brace my body for the damp cold that had become my only constant. When I saw the floral wallpaper and the soft glow of a lamp instead, I felt a surge of panic so sharp it nearly took my breath away. Safety felt like an intrusion, a foreign language I had forgotten how to speak. I was a 68-year-old woman who had been discarded like a broken toy, and the softness of a real bed felt like a mockery of the life I had lost. I kept expecting Julian to walk through the door, his face twisted in that rehearsed pity, telling me that I was a burden and that I didn't deserve to be in the light. But the door stayed closed, and the only sound was the steady, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Clara entered the room with 2 mugs of coffee, the steam rising in lazy curls. She didn't ask me how I was feeling. She knew the answer was written in the hollows of my cheeks and the way I flinched at every sudden movement. She sat in the armchair opposite me, her face a mask of quiet determination. We had spent decades together, raising our children and tending our gardens, but the woman sitting in front of her now was someone else. I was a survivor of a war that had taken place in my own living room. I looked at the coffee, the dark liquid reflecting my own tired eyes, and I felt a flicker of the Evelyn I used to be. The teacher who didn't let bullies win, the wife who had stood by Robert through every storm. That woman was buried under layers of shame, but she wasn't dead. "I called him, Evelyn," Clara said, her voice low but steady. "I called Daniel Vance. He's a lawyer who specializes in elder financial exploitation. He's young, but he's hungry, and he's the best person I know for this. He's coming over this afternoon." The word exploitation hit me like a physical blow. It was a cold, clinical word for something that felt like a knife in the back. I wanted to tell her that it was a mistake, that Julian was just confused, that Ava had poisoned his mind. But then I remembered the deadbolt. I remembered the black trash bags landing on the basement floor. I remembered the $2 million. My son had sold his mother's soul for a condo in the Pearl District, and there was no way to dress that up as a misunderstanding. I took a sip of the coffee, the heat burning my throat, and I nodded. "I have the phone, Clara," I whispered. My hand went instinctively to the pocket of the grey sweater she had lent me. I pulled out the old smartphone, the one Julian had forgotten I had. It was a small piece of plastic and glass, but it held the only truth left in the world. I recorded the night he told me they were selling the house. I recorded Ava telling him that I was a liability. I recorded him saying that they had liquidated the trust for his gambling debts. I pressed play, and the room was suddenly filled with the sound of my own destruction. The muffled voices from above the basement ceiling were sharp and clear. I heard Ava's voice, like a blade of ice, talking about market peaks and portfolio optimization. I heard Julian's heavy sigh, the sound of a man who had already decided that his mother was less valuable than a real estate commission. When the recording reached the part where Julian told me that he had used the money for his business debts, Clara's grip on her mug tightened until her knuckles were white. The silence that followed the recording was even heavier than before. "He gambled away your life, Evelyn," Clara said, her voice trembling with a fury she was trying to contain. "He didn't just take the house. He took your security and threw it into a hole of his own making. He and that woman are monsters." I looked out at the rain. I thought about the night Julian was born, the way he had gripped my finger with his tiny, perfect hand. I had spent 38 years protecting him, shielding him from every cold wind, and in the end, he had been the one to push me out into the storm. It was a betrayal that went beyond money. It was a violation of the most basic law of nature. A mother protects her child, and a child honors his mother. Julian had broken that law, and in doing so, he had forfeited the right to call me Mum. Daniel Vance arrived at 3 o'clock. He was a tall, lean man with sharp eyes and a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for a difficult operation. I laid everything out on the table. The quitclaim deed I had signed under duress, the slow slide into the basement, the changing of the locks, and finally the recording. He listened to the audio twice, his pen flying across a legal pad. "This is not just a civil matter, Mrs. Miller," Daniel said, his voice calm but filled with a dangerous edge. "This is elder abuse, fraudulent inducement. The way they isolated you and manipulated your trust is a textbook case. And the gambling? If he used funds that were supposed to be held in a trust for your care to pay off personal debts, that is a crime." Julian thought he was being clever, but he's left a trail of crumbs that lead right to the Pearl District. "Can we get it back, Daniel?" I asked, my voice finally finding its strength. "Can we take back the house?" Daniel leaned back, his eyes fixed on mine. "The house has been sold to a third party, and that complicates things. But we can sue for the full value of the property, $2 million. We can go after Julian's personal assets, his commissions, and whatever he bought with your money. We can also file for a temporary restraining order and an emergency freeze on his bank accounts. If we act fast, we can stop him from spending another dime of your legacy." Legacy. It was a word that Robert used to talk about. He wanted us to have something to leave behind, something that said we were here and that we mattered. Julian had taken that legacy and turned it into a bet. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settling over me. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a plaintiff. I was an advocate. I was a woman who was done being invisible. "I don't want the money just for the sake of the money, Daniel," I said, my words coming out clear and unwavering. "I want him to have to look at what he did. I want Ava to realize that the old woman she tried to bury in the basement isn't going away. I want my name back." "We'll get your name back, Evelyn," Daniel promised. "We'll get your life back too." The next few days were a blur of activity. Daniel worked out of Clara's living room, surrounded by piles of documents and the constant chime of incoming emails. I spent my time going through the trash bags Julian had given me. I found the photo album, the edges curled from the dampness of the basement. I flipped through those pages, seeing the faces of people who had been dead for years. And then I saw the pictures of Julian. Julian at 5, Julian at 10, Julian on his wedding day. I took a pair of scissors and I cut him out of every single photograph. I didn't do it with anger. I did it with a quiet, surgical precision. I was removing the tumor from my memory. I was realizing that the boy in these pictures didn't exist anymore, and the man who had replaced him didn't deserve a place in my history. When I was finished, the floor was covered in tiny, jagged pieces of my son's face. I swept them into a pile and threw them into the kitchen trash. It was the most liberating thing I had done in years. Clara watched me from the doorway, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and pride. She knew what it cost me to do that. She knew that every snip of the scissors was a piece of my heart being cut away. But she also knew that I was healing. The U-curve of my emotion was finally starting to tilt upward. I was moving from the despair of the bridge to the cold, hard resolve of the battle. Daniel came in then, his face illuminated by the blue light of his laptop. "I found it, Evelyn. I found the paper trail. Julian didn't just pay off his own debts. He moved $900,000 into an offshore account in Ava's name 3 days before the house was sold. They were planning to disappear. They have tickets to Cabo for next Friday. They thought they could leave you under the bridge and fly off into the sunset with your money." $900,000. The numbers were so large they felt abstract, like a distance between stars. But the intent was clear. It was a premeditated disappearance. It was a final, absolute abandonment. "They won't be going to Cabo, Daniel," I said, my voice as cold as the Portland River. "Not if I have anything to say about it." "They won't," Daniel agreed. "I've already filed for an emergency injunction. A judge is reviewing the file as we speak. By tomorrow morning, Julian's world is going to start shrinking. He thinks he's a master of the deal, but he forgot that the most important part of any contract is the fine print. And in the state of Oregon, the law protects the vulnerable from the greedy." I sat at the table and looked at the rain. It was still falling, a relentless, grey veil over the city. I thought about the thousands of people who were still out there, under the bridges, in the doorways, in the shelters. I thought about the mothers whose sons had also decided they were no longer worth the cost. I felt a surge of responsibility, a weight that wasn't heavy, but solid. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for every person who had been made to feel like they were clutter. I was fighting for the dignity that Julian had tried to throw away in a black plastic bag. That night, I didn't sleep in a state of fear. I slept in a state of preparation. I dreamed of the West Hills house, but it wasn't a nightmare anymore. In the dream, I was standing on the porch, and the roses were in full bloom, their scent thick and sweet in the air. I was holding a key, a heavy silver key that felt warm in my hand. I walked up to the front door and I turned the lock. The click wasn't the sound of a deadbolt closing me out. It was the sound of a door opening. I walked inside and the house was filled with light, a bright, blinding light that washed away the shadows of the basement. I woke up at dawn. The first light of morning filtered through Clara's curtains, and I knew that the dream was a prophecy. Clara was already in the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee, a comforting, domestic anchor. I walked in and sat down, and for the first time in months, I felt hungry. I ate a piece of toast, the crunch of the bread, a solid, real thing. I looked at Clara, and I saw the woman who had saved me. "Thank you, Clara," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for not looking away." "That's what friends do, Evelyn," she said, her hand reaching out to squeeze mine. "We carry each other when the road gets too steep." "Now, are you ready?" Daniel called. The injunction was granted. The freeze is in effect. Julian and Ava are about to find out that their credit cards aren't working. I felt a small, grim smile touch my lips. It was the first time I had smiled in a long time. It felt strange, like my face was learning a new language, but it felt good. It felt right. "I'm ready," I said. "Let's go and get my life back." We spent the afternoon in Daniel's office on Fifth Avenue. The office was all glass and steel, a high, airy place that felt like it was above the clouds. We sat around a conference table, and Daniel showed us the strategy. We were going to file a civil suit for elder abuse and fraud. We were going to notify the district attorney's office about the gambling debts and the offshore accounts. We were going to make it impossible for Julian to hide. "He'll try to settle," Daniel warned. "He'll offer you a fraction of the money. He'll cry and say he's sorry. He'll use the boy you raised against the woman you've become. You have to be ready for that, Evelyn." "I am ready," I said. "He's not the boy I raised anymore. He's a stranger who shares my DNA. The boy I raised wouldn't have let his mother walk down the hill in the rain with her life in trash bags. The boy I raised is gone, and I've already mourned him." Daniel nodded, a flash of respect in his eyes. "Good. Then we have them. They've already been served. Julian tried to call the firm 10 times in the last hour. He's panicking. He's realizing that the old woman under the bridge was actually the one holding all the cards." I looked out the window at the city of Portland. The rain had stopped, and for a split second, a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the white peaks of the mountains in the distance. It was a beautiful sight, a reminder that the world was larger than my pain. I felt the tiny spark in my chest grow into a steady, warm flame. I was Evelyn Miller, and I was no longer a ghost. I was a force to be reckoned with. Julian had taken my house, but he had given me something much more powerful. He had given me the truth. And with Daniel at my side and Clara at my back, I was going to use that truth to burn his perfect stolen life to the ground. The U-curve was rising, and the reckoning was finally within my reach. I took a deep breath, the air in the high office feeling fresh and clean. The path ahead was still long, and there would be more battles to fight, more memories to process. But as I looked at the legal documents spread out before me, I didn't see papers. I saw the tools of my reconstruction. I was rebuilding my home, not with bricks and mortar, but with justice and self-respect. And as the sun finally set over the Willamette River, casting a long golden light over the city, I knew that the bridge was behind me. I was on the other side now, and I was never going back to the dark. I was moving toward the light, and this time, I was the one holding the key. The tires of Daniel's sleek black sedan crunched over the gravel driveway of the West Hills house, with a sound that felt like bone grinding against bone. I sat in the back seat, my fingers digging into the leather upholstery until my knuckles turned a ghostly white. This was the driveway where I had taught Julian how to ride a bike, the same path where Robert and I had walked hand in hand every evening for 4 decades. Now the house stood before me like an imposing stranger, its familiar Victorian gables looking sharp and jagged against the grey Portland sky. The front porch, where I had spent countless summer afternoons reading, was now cluttered with sleek, modern outdoor furniture that looked cold and inhospitable. I felt a surge of nausea so strong I had to close my eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of the car's lavender air freshener to drown out the phantom smell of the basement mildew. I was no longer the broken woman under the Burnside Bridge. I was the ghost returning to the scene of the crime, and I had brought the storm with me. Daniel stepped out first, adjusting his suit jacket with a chillingly calm precision. Clara sat beside me, her hand resting firmly on my forearm. She didn't say a word, but her presence was a solid anchor in the churning sea of my anxiety. We walked toward the front door, my front door, and for a split second, I reached into my pocket for my keys before remembering that the locks had been changed, my history erased by a locksmith's bill. Daniel didn't knock. He pressed the doorbell, the chime echoing through the house with a hollow, mocking sweetness. We waited. The silence was heavy, broken only by the steady drip of rain from the overflowing gutters. Then, the sound of the deadbolt sliding back, the same sound that had been my death knell a week ago, cut through the air. Julian opened the door. He was wearing an expensive cashmere sweater and holding a glass of wine, the picture of a man who had successfully traded his mother for a lifestyle. When his eyes met mine, the glass slipped slightly in his hand, a drop of dark red liquid splashing onto the pristine hardwood floor like a drop of blood. He looked older, the stress of his lies carving deep, jagged lines around his mouth. Behind him I could see Ava, her hair perfectly coiffed, her eyes narrowing with a predatory sharpest as she realized who was standing on her doorstep. "Mum?" Julian's voice was a strangled whisper, a pathetic imitation of the son I used to know. "What are you doing here? We have a closing tomorrow. You shouldn't be here." "Actually, Mr. Miller," Daniel said, stepping forward and presenting a thick folder of legal documents, "Mrs. Miller has every right to be here. I am Daniel Vance, counsel for Evelyn Miller. We are here to serve you with a temporary restraining order and a notice of emergency freeze on all your domestic and international assets. We also have a court order for an immediate inspection of the premises." Julian stumbled back, the wine glass finally shattering against the floor. The sound of breaking glass felt like the first note of a symphony. Ava rushed forward, her face a mask of calculated fury. "This is private property. You can't just barge in here with some cheap lawyer and make threats. Evelyn is mentally unstable. We have documentation." "You have forged documentation, Ava," I said, my voice coming out steady and cold, a sound that seemed to surprise even Julian. I stepped over the threshold, into the hallway that Robert had painted the summer before he died. "I'm not the woman you locked in the basement anymore. I've seen the abyss, and I'm not afraid of you. I know about the $900,000 in the Carbo account. I know about the gambling debts, and I have the recording of you telling Julian that I was a liability." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian looked as if he had been struck. He turned to Ava, his eyes wide and pleading, looking for a lie that would save him. But Ava was staring at me, her mask finally crumbling to reveal the hollow, desperate woman beneath. She looked at the legal papers in Daniel's hand as if they were a death warrant. "The recording?" Julian whispered, his face turning a sickly shade of grey. "Every word, Julian," I said, walking past him into the living room. It was stripped of its warmth. My rugs were gone, replaced by grey, industrial-looking wool. My books had been cleared from the shelves, replaced by empty decorative vases. It felt like a stage set, a hollow imitation of a home. I turned to face him, the son I had loved with every fibre of my being. "You told me you were taking care of me. You knelt by my chair and told me Robert would want me to be safe. And then you sold the roof over my head to pay for a poker game. You threw my life into trash bags and locked the door." "Mum, the business was failing. I was going to lose everything," Julian started, the excuses falling from his lips like spoiled fruit. "I thought if I could just get enough for a deposit on a place for you, somewhere professional." "Don't!" I snapped. The word was a whip. "Don't you dare lie to me again. You didn't care about a deposit. You were moving $900,000 to Mexico while I was sitting on a piece of cardboard under a bridge. You didn't care if I lived or died, as long as the check cleared. You aren't a man of action, Julian. You're a coward who hides behind his mother's signature." Daniel began to move through the house, his camera clicking as he documented the removal of Robert's personal property. Each flash of the camera felt like a small explosion of truth. Ava tried to block his path, her voice rising into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "This is a mistake. Julian, do something. Call the police. Tell them she's trespassing." "Please, call them," Daniel said, without looking up from his camera. "I'd be happy to explain to the Portland Police Department how you moved stolen assets into an offshore account 24 hours after an illegal eviction. I'm sure they'd love to hear about the fraudulent quitclaim deed." Julian sank into one of the sleek, modern chairs, his head in his hands. He looked small. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to go to him, to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I realized that the son I had raised had been dead for a long time, replaced by this hollow vessel of greed. I walked to the fireplace, my fingers tracing the mahogany mantel. I remembered the nights Robert and I had sat here, planning Julian's future, dreaming of the man he would become. We had built this house on a foundation of love and hard work, and Julian had tried to sell the very ground we stood on. "We're moving the cargo flight, Julian," Daniel said, standing in the center of the room. "The airport has been notified. Your passports are flagged. You aren't going anywhere except to a deposition. And Mrs. Miller is requesting an immediate audit of all estate transactions for the last 3 years. We suspect the embezzlement started long before the house was sold." Ava turned on Julian then, her voice a snarl of pure venom. "I told you we should have moved her to that facility in Idaho. I told you she was smarter than she looked. You're pathetic, Julian. You couldn't even handle one old woman." The betrayal in her voice was the final piece of the puzzle. Julian looked up at her, and for a second, I saw the realization dawn on him. He had sacrificed his mother for a woman who despised him. He had traded the only person who would have died for him for a partner who was already looking for the exit. It was a tragedy of his own making, a U-turn into a dead end. I walked over to the black trash bags sitting in the corner of the hallway. My bags. The bags Julian had thrown at me like I was garbage. I picked them up, the weight of my remaining life feeling light and insignificant. I looked at Julian one last time. "The closing isn't happening tomorrow, Julian," I said. "The title is clouded. The bank has been notified of the fraud. This house isn't yours to sell. It never was. It was a trust, and you violated it." "Where will you go?" Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm going to Clara's," I said. "And then I'm going to find a way to make sure that the West Hills house stays in the hands of someone who understands that a home isn't an asset. It's a sanctuary. You've lost everything, Julian. Not because I took it, but because you threw it away for a dream that was never yours." I walked out of the house, my head held high. The rain was still falling, but it didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like a cleansing. I stepped onto the porch and looked at the roses. They were wild and overgrown, the way Robert had liked them. I knew that the battle was just beginning, that there would be years of court dates and depositions, that I might never get the full value of the house back. But as I sat in Daniel's car and watched the West Hills house disappear into the mist, I felt a surge of a power I hadn't known I possessed. I had faced the monster in the living room, and I had seen him for what he was, a hollow, frightened boy who had forgotten the value of a mother's heart. As we drove away, I looked at Clara. She was smiling, a small, fierce smile that mirrored my own. I reached into my pocket and touched the old smartphone. The recording was still there, the digital ghost of my son's betrayal. I realized then that Julian had been right about one thing. I was a liability. I was the liability that was going to cost him everything. I was the ghost that was finally coming home to roost. The U-curve of my emotion had reached its peak, I was no longer sitting in the shadow of the bridge. I was standing in the light of the truth, and for the first time in months, I could breathe. The reckoning had come, and Julian Miller was about to find out that the most expensive thing in the world is the debt you owe to the woman who gave you life. I leaned back against the seat, the hum of the car's engine a steady, comforting rhythm. I looked at my hands, the same hands that had signed the deed, the same hands that had been dirty from the bridge, and I saw that they were steady. I was Evelyn Miller. I was a teacher. I was a widow. And I was the woman who had survived her own son's greed to tell the story. We pulled up to Clara's house, and the warmth of the small bungalow greeted me like a physical embrace. I walked inside, and the smell of lavender was even stronger than before. I sat at the kitchen table, and Daniel joined us, his face tired but satisfied. "He'll be arrested within the week, Evelyn," Daniel said. "The embezzlement from the trust is a felony, and with Ava's offshore account, she's going down as an accomplice. They thought they were being clever, but they were just being sloppy. Greed makes people stupid." "I don't feel happy, Daniel," I said, the words surprising even me. "I don't feel like I've won a victory." "That's because you've lost a son, Evelyn," Clara said softly, her hand covering mine. "And that is a wound that no court order can heal. But you've won your freedom. You've won the right to be treated with dignity, and that is worth more than $2 million. I nodded, the truth of her words sinking in. I looked at the window, at the grey Portland sky, and I realized that the reckoning wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about the reclamation of my own soul. Julian had tried to turn me into a ghost, but he had only succeeded in stripping away everything that was unnecessary. I was left with the truth, and the truth was enough. I was no longer the woman under the bridge. I was the woman who had walked through the fire and come out the other side, and the man who had started the fire was the only one who was going to get burned. I picked up a pen from Clara's table, a simple plastic ballpoint pen. I felt its weight in my hand. It was a different weight than the gold fountain pen Julian had given me. It felt real. It felt honest. I reached for a piece of paper and I began to write. I wasn't writing a legal document or a letter of apology. I was writing the final chapter of my story. I was writing about the rain, the bridge, and the deadbolt. I was writing about the son I had lost and the woman I had found. And as I wrote, the ink flowed across the page, black and permanent, a testament to the fact that I was still here. Evelyn Miller was still here, and she was finally telling the truth. The courtroom was silent, a heavy, sterile silence that felt miles away from the damp, roaring darkness of the Burnside Bridge. I sat in the front row, wearing a dress Clara had found for me, a soft, charcoal wool that felt like a shield. I didn't look at Julian. I couldn't, not because I was afraid, but because I was tired of searching for a ghost. The man sitting at the defense table, his head bowed, his expensive cashmere sweater replaced by a cheap, wrinkled suit, was a stranger. He was the consequence of 1,000 small, greedy choices, a man who had sold his soul in increments until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. Ava sat beside him, her perfect mask finally shattered. She looked small, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal, realizing that the offshore accounts and the $2 million dream had evaporated under the cold, hard light of the law. Daniel stood beside me, his presence a steady, silent reassurance. He had spent months untangling the web of lies Julian had spun, and today the final thread was being pulled. The judge's voice was a low, rhythmic drone as he read the sentencing. Embezzlement, elder financial exploitation, fraudulent inducement. The words sounded like a foreign language, a clinical way of describing the night Julian had locked me out in the rain. I listened to the sentence, 5 years for Julian, a suspended sentence and heavy restitution for Ava, and I felt nothing. No surge of triumph, no warmth of revenge, just a profound, echoing hollowness. I realized then that justice is not a cure for a broken heart. It is simply an accounting. It is a way for the world to say that what happened was wrong, but it cannot put the silver spoons back in the drawer or the love back in the sun. Julian looked up as the bailiff approached him with the handcuffs. For a split second, our eyes met. I looked for the boy who used to bring me dandelions. I looked for the child who cried when he scraped his knee. But all I saw was a man who was sorry he got caught, not sorry for what he had done. I looked away, and in that moment, the last cord of my motherly guilt snapped. We walked out of the courthouse and into the Portland spring. The air was crisp, the scent of cherry blossoms, thick and sweet, a sharp contrast to the metallic tang of the bridge. Clara took my arm, her grip firm and familiar. We didn't talk about the trial. We didn't talk about Julian. We talked about the garden. We talked about the new hybrid roses she wanted to plant and the way the sunlight hit the Willamette River in the late afternoon. I felt light, as if I were made of glass and feathers. The weight of the West Hills house, the weight of the silver and the mahogany, the weight of 38 years of being Julian's mother, it was all gone. I was just Evelyn. I was a woman who was 68 years old and had absolutely nothing to her name, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely, terrifyingly free. We drove back to West Hills one last time. The house had been returned to me by court order, the fraudulent deed annulled, the third-party sale blocked by the cloud on the title. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the Victorian gables, the overgrown roses, the porch where Robert and I had planned a future that never arrived. It was mine again, every brick, every window, every memory. But as I stood there, I realized something that made my heart stop. I didn't want it. The house was tainted. It was filled with the echoes of Ava's designer heels and the smell of Julian's Chardonnay. It was the place where my son had turned me into a ghost, and I didn't want to live among the shadows of my own destruction. The West Hills house wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a monument to a betrayal that I was finally ready to leave behind. "I'm going to sell it, Clara," I said, the words surprising even me. Clara looked at me, her eyes wide with shock. "Sell it? Evelyn, this is your home. Robert worked his whole life for this." "Robert worked so I would be safe, Clara. He didn't work so I would be a prisoner of the past. This house, it's a burden. It's too big for one woman and 1,000 ghosts. I want to move. I want a small place, maybe near the park, with a window that lets in the morning sun. I want a kitchen where I can cook what I want, when I want. I want to start over." The decision felt like a physical release, a long, deep exhale after holding my breath for months. I walked into the house, moving through the rooms that Daniel's team had cleared of the minimalist clutter Ava had installed. I walked into the basement, the concrete cold and silent. I stood where my bed had been, next to the water heater, and I felt a strange sense of gratitude for that darkness. It was in the basement that I had discovered the truth. It was in the basement that I had realized that I was stronger than the man I had raised. I walked out of the basement and closed the door, and this time I didn't listen for the click of the deadbolt. I was the one holding the key. The sale of the house was quick. In the booming Portland market, a West Hills Victorian is a prize, and within a week I had an offer that would ensure I never had to worry about a deposit again. I used the money to buy a small cottage in northeast Portland, a place with a wide front porch and a patch of dirt where I could plant my own roses. It was a humble place, but it was mine. No quitclaim deeds, no trusts, no innovation labs, just four walls and a roof that belonged to me and no one else. Clara helped me move the few things I had left: the photo album with the jagged edges, the silver tinsel lure from Robert's tackle box, and a few boxes of books. We spent the afternoon painting the living room a soft, warm cream, the colour of a fresh start. I sat on my new porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of violet and gold. The rain had stopped, and the air was still. I thought about the bridge. I thought about the man on the cardboard and the roar of the city above. I realized then that my son had tried to steal my life, but he had only succeeded in stripping away the things that didn't matter. He had taken the bricks and the mortar, but he had left the soul. I thought about Julian in his cell, and I felt a flicker of a different kind of pain. It wasn't the pain of betrayal anymore. It was the pain of a teacher who had failed to teach her most important student the value of a heart. I forgave him then. Not for his sake. He hadn't asked for it, and he likely never would, but for mine. Forgiveness is not a gift you give to the person who hurt you. It is the key you use to unlock your own cage. I forgave him so that I wouldn't have to carry him with me anymore. I forgave him so that I could be Evelyn Miller again. The silence of my new home was different. It wasn't the heavy, expectant silence of the basement. It was a light, airy silence, a silence that felt like a conversation with myself. I began to write. I sat at the small wooden table in my sun-drenched kitchen, and I wrote the story of the bridge. I wrote about the cold concrete and the yellow umbrella. I wrote about the son who became a stranger and the friend who became a sister. I wrote for the people who were still under the bridge, the people who were still invisible, the people who thought that their story had already ended. I realized that my voice was the only thing Julian hadn't been able to liquidate, and I was going to use it until every ghost in Portland was heard. One afternoon, a few months after the trial, I received a letter from Julian. It was written on prison stationery, the ink smeared and the handwriting shaky. I held it for a long time, the paper feeling heavy in my hand. I thought about opening it. I thought about reading his excuses, his pleas for money, his hollow apologies. But then I looked at the roses in my garden, blooming red and vibrant in the spring sun. I thought about the way the light hit my kitchen table and the sound of my own footsteps on the hardwood floor. I didn't need to read the letter. I already knew the ending of his story, and it wasn't part of mine anymore. I walked to the fireplace and I dropped the letter into the small, warm flame. I watched the paper curl and turn to ash, the words disappearing into the heat. It was the final reckoning, the final release. I am Evelyn Miller. I am 70 years old, and I am a survivor. I have lost a house and a son, but I have found a life. I spend my days in the garden, my hands in the dirt, tending to the things that grow. I spend my evenings with Clara, sharing stories and lemon bars on the porch. Sometimes, when the rain falls, I think about the Burnside Bridge. I think about the woman on the cardboard and the way the water felt like a shroud. I don't look back with fear. I look back with the knowledge that the darkness is only a tunnel, and if you keep walking, you will eventually find the light. Julian thought he was taking care of me by taking everything I had. He was right, in a way he could never understand. He took away the life I thought I needed so that I could find the life I was meant to have. The U-curve had reached its end, and I was standing on the peak, looking out at a world that was wide and bright and full of a beauty that no real estate deal could ever touch. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of the damp earth and the blooming roses. The silence was no longer a grave, it was a song. I thought about the little blue lure in my pocket, and I smiled. Robert would have liked this house. He would have liked the way the light hits the floor, and the way the roses grow wild against the fence. He would have liked the woman I had become, a woman who didn't need a mansion to feel like a queen, a woman who knew that the only thing you truly own is the truth of your own story. I stood up and walked into my kitchen, the sound of my own shoes a steady, confident rhythm. I turned on the light, and the room was filled with a warm, golden glow. I was Evelyn Miller, and I was finally, truly home. The most agonizing part of surviving a betrayal by your own flesh and blood is the heavy, suffocating blanket of self-blame that threatens to pull you under. I spent countless nights under the cold shadow of that bridge, wondering where I had failed as a mother, as if my love could have somehow mended the hollow spaces in my son's soul. But the true liberation began the moment I realized that his choices were never my burden to carry. They were his alone. Forgiving myself was the hardest battle I ever fought, but it was the only one that mattered. Today, as I watch the sunset, I finally understand that light doesn't just return after a trauma. It is something you build, one brave breath at a time, until the darkness simply has no room left to stay.